Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's my pleasure to start this webinar this afternoon here in Paris. And I want to welcome all of you to this high-level launch event for the OECD's Council Recommendation on Broadband Connectivity, called Connectivity for All. We're really pleased to have you here and join us and officially launch this important instrument. And I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to do so. My name is Andrew Wyckoff, and I'm the Director of Science, Technology, and Innovation at the OECD. We come together today to launch this OECD legal instrument that really just couldn't be more timely or relevant. And it's entitled the OECD Council Recommendation on Broadband Connectivity. Reliable connectivity is a key pillar of our economies and a prerequisite for the digital transformation. And it's important to become even more apparent as we encounter economic and social difficulties where we've been able to go online to keep these activities going, whether it's been e-education, e-commerce, or meetings like today. In the COVID pandemic, this has been a lifeline. And again, what we're doing today is just another example of this. Now, this puts a higher premium on the need for countries to respond to the need for better connectivity across the world. And the OECD Council Recommendation puts forward a roadmap of overarching policies and regulation to extend broadband networks and upgrade the quality of these networks. I'm really pleased to invite an impressive high-level policy and key decision makers from different countries who will share with us how they're applying the provisions of the recommendation to extend connectivity and build a connected world. Now, before we start with these opening remarks, I just want to highlight a few housekeeping items here. At the OECD, we have two official languages. They include English and French, and both are available. If you want to change the language, please click on the interpretation icon found at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. Also, I want to tell everyone the meeting will be recorded by the OECD Secretary, and we would ask that you refrain from recording yourself, as this will lead to technical difficulties on our side. With that, I now give the floor to OECD Deputy Secretary General, Mr. Ulrich Vestergaard Knudsen, and the head of the Digital Economy Policy Division, Ms. Audrey Hong, for their opening remarks this high-level launch event. Ulrich.
Thank you very much, Andy. Good afternoon, Vice Minister, Deputy Minister, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It really is a great pleasure for me today to launch the OECD's Council Recommendation on Broadband Connectivity. If anything, this pandemic has taught us very clearly that reliable and affordable connectivity, and I would even say fast connectivity, is indispensable. Over the past year or so, millions of us, but not all of us, have moved online to work, to play, and to learn. Children with internet access at home have been able to continue their education remotely, and whether it be through Zoom or Skype or any other of the many video chat and conferencing apps, people have been able to stay connected while being physically apart, just like we are here today. In many ways, connectivity has kept the economy and international trade going in difficult times. I often tell my children that imagine this had happened 30 years ago, what kind of impact it would have had on our societies and economies. We would not have been able to continue working, to continue playing, to continue learning. So in many sense, we are the lucky. But unfortunately, this has not been a lifeline for all. Almost half of the world's population have no access to the internet. The pandemic has sped up an already rapid digital transformation, but without connectivity, millions of people ultimately face even greater exclusion. We need to build back better from this crisis. And I always say that if the big lesson from the last international crisis, the big financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, was that we underestimated the importance of spreading evenly the benefits of globalization. I think the important task ahead of us as we come out of this crisis is not to underestimate spreading the benefits of digitalization. These are two phenomenal motors, globalization and digitalization, but they share two features. One is that they are able to bring us immense amounts of prosperity, but the benefits from them are not spread evenly, and I think that will be probably one of the major attention points for us as we try to build back better from this crisis. And I think central to that is certainly addressing the connectivity imbalance. It has become more urgent than that. We will not meet this task. We will not overcome the digital divide if we do not correct the connectivity imbalance. How can we then ensure full, affordable, and timely coverage for all? And not only that, how can we also ensure high quality connectivity for all? Well, this is where the OECD's recommendation on broadband connectivity comes in, because it really does provide a multi-stakeholder response and at global scale. It leverages the knowledge and experience built over decades in our working party on communication infrastructures and services policy, and also our committee on digital economy policy, as well as guidance from others across the organization. And I'd also like to draw the attention to the recommendations call to use data as an important policy tool to extend and improve connectivity. Evidence-based policy making plays a crucial role in designing, in implementing, and in delivering better policies. We hope that the OECD broadband portal will continue to serve as a valuable resource, and I invite all of you to please check out our latest data on connectivity compiled in preparation of this launch event. Now, the 37 OECD countries that span the globe have all adopted this new standard. Beyond the OECD, I welcome Brazil as an adherent today and hope that there will be many others in the future. We have had the pleasure of enjoying that kind of spread in some of our earlier work at the OECD and also with Andy and colleagues in STI. Think about the principles for artificial intelligence, for example. Our next step will be to focus our efforts on disseminating this important standard worldwide and working with countries to ensure its full and effective implementation. In this regard, we all very much look forward to hearing from our distinguished speakers and audience today. We have, as Andy said, a very impressive lineup of decision makers from all across the world who made time in their busy agendas to join us today. Thank you so much for that. So let's bring together different perspectives and our joint knowledge and expertise to work towards unleashing the potential of this new standard to build a more connected world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulrich. And I turn over to Ms. Plonk.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you, Vice Minister, Deputy Minister, distinguished panelists, and ladies and gentlemen. My name is Audrey Plonk. I'm the head of division for the digital economy policy at the OECD. And I have the privilege today to talk with you about the recommendation for broadband connectivity. I want to start by illustrating the effects of the pandemic on the demand for connectivity. You can see here the striking growth of internet traffic produced at the biggest internet exchange points, which are essentially crossroads where multiple networks interconnect to exchange traffic. The traffic not only increased dramatically in countries with traditionally high traffic, Brazil and Germany, where you see on the left, but also South Africa, where it grew more than 90%, and in Chile by an amazing 160%. Those percentage in growth is indicated by the red diamond on the chart. The average internet bandwidth growth in OECD areas was 58.4% from December of 2019 to December of 2020. Absolutely incredible. Taking a more granular view, our new data on the OECD broadband portal reveals that the pandemic has spurred the uptake of high-speed broadband subscriptions. Up until 2019, we were adding about 6.8 million new fixed broadband subscriptions every 6 months in the OECD area. However, in the first half of 2020, and thus the first phase of the pandemic, the number of new fixed broadband subscriptions jumped to 10.3 million. This represents a 50% growth. As such, we also saw that users have been upgrading their connections during the pandemic, reflecting the need for symmetrical speeds to work and study from home. Fiber has been the fastest growing technology in OECD countries over the past decade, and the share of fiber in all fixed broadband subscriptions in OECD countries rose to 29.2% by June of 2020. However, what's also evident from these numbers is that there's still considerable need to not only extend networks, especially to underserved areas, but also to increase the quality of broadband connections. So with regard to the recommendation, this recommendation on broadband connectivity responds to that need in providing a holistic set of policies and regulation. It was developed building on the vast experience of the Working Party on Communications, Infrastructure Services and Policy, which has a track record for pushing the boundaries of communications policy since the 1980s. It is structured around 5 key provisions focused on, first, fostering competition, investment, and innovation. Second, eliminating digital divides and reducing barriers to broadband deployment. Third, ensuring resilient, reliable, secure, and high-capacity networks. Fourth, minimizing negative environmental impacts of communication networks. And finally, assessing broadband markets. I'll briefly describe some of these provisions. So first, under the first pillar, the recommendation stresses the importance of promoting competition in communications markets. Promoting competition is one of the strongest levers to extend connectivity and increase quality. In multiple instances, we have seen that with an increased level of competition, innovation goes up, prices go down, and companies invest. For example, in Mexico, increased competition since the reform in 2013 led to a price decline of up to 84% in the mobile broadband market over the period of 2012 to 2020. Affordability can be a major barrier of internet adoption, and as prices declined, as experienced in Mexico, thanks to competition, it contributed to adding over 72 million additional broadband subscriptions between that same period, 2012 to 2020. This was equivalent to slightly more than the entire population of Colombia and Chile combined. This allowed many people, especially from low-income households, to connect to the internet for the first time. With this, I would like to highlight that fixed and mobile networks are complementary. There is no 5G without fiber. Upgrading networks to future-proof technologies such as fiber and deploying fiber deeper into networks is key to support increases in speed and capacity of the broadband networks across all next-generation technologies, regardless of whether it's the last mile, mobile, cable, etc. The recommendation further contains measures to tackle digital divides, which is the topic at the heart of the policy agenda today. This can be done through developing smart policies that reduce barriers to broadband deployment, such as simplified licensing procedures and streamlined access to rights, or by incentivizing operators to cooperate with civil construction works to minimize cost and environmental impacts. Finally, sections of provisions 3 and 5 deal with what is at the center of OECD's work, the value of evidence in designing better policies for better lives, and in this particular case, to promote high-quality connectivity. Provision 3.1, for example, calls for the publication of subscription and quality of service data to improve network quality. Provision 5 further calls on countries to show the progress of their initiatives and to highlight areas for improvement by assessing the actual state of connectivity through collecting and publishing data. For example, about the progress in closing digital divides. This is one way to determine whether public policy initiatives are appropriate and whether and how they should be adjusted in the future. So with that, I just want to say that let's work on connectivity for all together. I thank you for your attention and for your time today. And here on the screen, you see reference to the recommendation and the OECD broadband portal and related resources. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ulrich and Audrey, for setting the stage for this launch event and introducing the key principles of the OECD recommendation on broadband connectivity. Now it's with great pleasure I now introduce Mr. Tae-Shik Cho, with the Vice Minister in the Ministry of Science and ICT, MSIT, for Korea, for his keynote speech. Vice Minister Cho brings more than 30 years of experience on digital and ICT topics and has held roles within the Ministry of Science and ICT, the Korea Communications Commission, and the Ministry of Information and Communication. He has also worked in the Korean Presidential Office, focusing on enhancing Korea's competitiveness, especially in artificial intelligence and 5G networks. Korea has historically played a leadership role in the OECD, both in terms of connectivity and other policies. And we deeply appreciate Korea's close collaboration with the OECD over the years. Vice Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Wyckoff. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for inviting me as a keynote speaker at this meaningful gathering. I am very honored to have an opportunity to share Korea's policy experience for broadband connectivity. First of all, congratulations on the adoption of the OECD recommendation on broadband connectivity. I'd like to express my gratitude to the OECD Secretariat, country delegate, and experts who have endeavored to develop the recommendation. I hope the recommendation contributes to improving connectivity in OECD member countries and beyond. Today, I'll present Korea's policy on nationwide broadband deployment, broadband as a universal service, quality assessment, network resilience, mobile infrastructure, and I'll finish with Korea's Digital New Deal strategy. Next, please. I think there are several success factors that contribute to the establishment of robust broadband infrastructure of Korea. First, efficient implementation system. A ministry dedicated to ICT policy was established. The Informatization Promotion Act was created to lay the institutional foundation, and an ample amount of funds was raised through the Informatization Promotion Fund. All of these worked as strong drivers of policy implementation. Second, the government improved licensing regulation to lower entry barriers and relaxed the telecom investment restriction for domestic and foreign investors to promote competition. Third, we had no price regulation on broadband, which promoted competition in the market and led to affordable prices. Fourth, the government led the investment in establishing National Information Superhighway for administration, finance, education, and so on to drive the demand for a telecommunication market. Next. We designated high-speed broadband over 100 megabps as a universal service in January 2020 to improve connectivity in remote areas. Another policy to enhance connectivity is quality assessment. Starting with high-speed internet service in 2008, Korea has been conducting quality assessment for 3G, 4G, and even 5G. The assessment results are released to the public. Through the quality assessment, we are able to promote competition and encourage investment in networks while improving user benefits. Next. These are policies to strengthen network resilience. First, resilience to risks in physical facilities. Telecom operators are required to deploy firefighting systems at their cable tunnels, and they have to ensure dual network system in case of communications blackout. With the transition into digital economy, everyone is now prone to cyber attacks anywhere, anytime. We established the K cybersecurity promotion strategy this February. This aims not only to investigate the cause of cyber incident, but also to build a cyber response system that provides a solution for recovery and prevention throughout all stages of the cybersecurity lifestyle. Next, please. I'll move on to Korea's policy on advancing mobile telecommunication service. After launching the world's first commercial CDMA service, Korea successfully rolled out commercial 5G networks for the first time in the world. Of course, telecom operators have strived to achieve such success, but the government's support also played a key part. With the advancement of mobile generation, the Korean government introduced measures to promote competition, which includes switching the market system from monopoly to competition and requiring facility-based telecom operators to provide their network facilities to other operators. For efficient deployment of 5G, the government also introduced joint installation and use of telecommunications facilities. Next, please. Lastly, I would like to present Korea's Digital New Deal strategy. Last July, the government announced the Digital New Deal to overcome the economic crisis induced by COVID-19 and accelerate digital transformation. According to the Digital New Deal plan, $52 billion, which comprises 36% of the annual total budget, will be invested for 5 years to create a new market and stimulate private demand. 12 tasks in 4 major sectors have been selected. The 4 major sectors are a stronger DNA ecosystem, digital transformation of educational infrastructure, promotion of contactless service, and digitalization of SOC infrastructure. Next, please. The first goal of the Digital New Deal is building a stronger DNA ecosystem to boost the economy. Our main focus is on data asset, the so-called oil of the fourth industrial revolution. To maximize the value of data, we'll build 30 big data platforms and create 1,300 types of data set for AI-based learning. Furthermore, emerging technologies that incorporate both 5G and AI, such as self-driving vehicles, will create synergy effect and be facilitated in the entire industry. By using the DNA ecosystem to improve people's quality of life, Korea aims to build a more intelligent government system. Moreover, the cybersecurity system in the country will be strengthened to effectively respond to increasing cyber threats. Next. This diagram explains the concept of data dam and helps to understand the relationship between DNA ecosystem and Digital New Deal. This virtual dam will amass the vast number of data generated through our public and private networks, including 5G, IoT, and cloud computing. Next, the data will be processed and consolidated according to the purpose. Then AI can use them to develop innovative digital service and products. Next. This is an end of my presentation. I hope Korea's policy cases contribute to a better connectivity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that keynote presentation, Vice Minister Cho. And with that, I now welcome Mr. Victor Menendez, Deputy Minister of Communications in Brazil. Deputy Minister Menendez has held various roles within the Ministry of Communications, its predecessor, the Ministry of Science, Technology, Innovations, Communication, and the National Telecommunications Agency, Anatel. He has also been integral to lead the work on the Brazilian side of the recently released OECD Telecommunication and Broadcasting Review that we launched jointly at the end of last year. We're very happy to have you, and also for Brazil's adherence to this important instrument, building on the wonderful cooperation the OECD enjoys with Brazil. Deputy Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Distinguished participants at this ceremony, ladies and gentlemen. would like to begin by saying what a pleasure it is to join you here today for this virtual event to launch of the OECD Council Recommendation on Broadband Connectivity. As you may know, Brazil, with a total population of over 210 million, has approximately 85% of citizens living in urban areas. The country has a territory of 8.5 million square kilometers and 5,570 municipalities. Despite these challenges, we are making significant progress in expanding network infrastructure and providing connectivity all over the country. With approximately 78.3% of the population online, Brazil ranks 50 globally and as well ranks third in average daily internet use. In 2020, e-commerce sales in Brazil grew at a rate of over 70%. This was the same year in which our central bank deployed a national instant payment system called PIX, which integrates all banks and financial institutions with their entire customer base of business and individuals, and currently generates over 400 million transactions every month. Indeed, these challenging times have accelerated our move toward the digital environment and demonstrated the essential role of broadband connectivity and internet access. During the current pandemic, the federal government created an emergent aid, which is a financial assistance for informal workers, the self-employed, and the unemployed. The beneficiaries registered by phone, internet, or mailing using a mobile phone app. This electronic payment system has benefited over 109 million people and became one of the most important digital and banking inclusion in our country. The Council Recommendation on Broadband Connectivity covers key guidelines for policymaking in telecom sector. This includes, among other aspects, promoting competition and implementing robust legal and regulatory frameworks, as well as fostering multi-stakeholder dialogue and promoting transparent spectrum management, bridging digital divides and closing gaps in unserved and underserved areas, ensuring security and resilience of networks, improving digital skills in collecting, analyzing, and publishing data. We believe these guidelines of the new recommendation closely align with public policy we have implemented over the last few years here in Brazil. Working with telecommunication service providers in Brazil, we have been able to ensure the robust, secure, accessible, and resilient operation of telecommunications network and digital infrastructure. Today, all municipalities in Brazil have mobile coverage in their urban areas with 4G service in 95% of them, and the remaining with at least 3G service. The most recent numbers show that over 81% of households have either fixed or mobile broadband services subscriptions. Internet use in homes is also noticeable gender balance in Brazil, with 79% of women and girls and 77% of men and boys using the internet. In terms of international broadband connectivity, Brazil continues to expand its network of internet exchange points, while with a highlight on the city of Fortaleza, which has become a major hub for submarine cables. The city now hosts landing stations and data center for 14 cables, providing direct connection to North and South America, as well as direct links to Europe and to Africa. The upcoming 5G spectrum auction, which takes place this year, will offer spectrum in 4 different harmonized frequency bands, allowing for competitive bidding in both national and regional blocks, suitable for a wide range of new applications. This is expected to attract not only the major players, but also a number of smaller regional players, which can greatly impact economic development. This spectrum auction will also provide the opportunity to extend coverage of at least 5G service to hundreds of districts and villages with population above 600 inhabitants, as well as seamless coverage on federal highways, expanding significantly territorial coverage. Another area of expansion in Brazil is in fiber connectivity infrastructure. Today, over 4,500 municipalities are connected to national backbones via fiber backhaul, currently covering 96% of the total population. We have put a public policy priority on extending fiber optic or other types of high-capacity backhaul to remaining municipalities in Brazil and as an essential infrastructure element to support high-quality fixed and mobile broadband services. As well, an existing federal government program to provide broadband internet access to all public schools has been a priority and a critical element to developing digital skills. To ensure that we continue to bridge the digital divides, we have similarly continued to expand satellite connectivity to rural public schools. This specific program utilizes Ka-band satellite capacity in the Brazilian Communications and Defense Geostationary Satellite, which provides full territorial coverage with broadband connectivity and internet service. This satellite is a key infrastructure providing digital inclusion in rural and remote unserved areas, ensuring that no one is left behind. I would also like to mention that we have made significant progress on the legal and regulatory framework to enhance an enabling environment for investment in broadband connectivity by the telecommunications sector. Brazil introduced a federal legislation and corresponding regulation on use of rights of way and antenna siting, requiring that local authorities take no more than 60 days to act on application for site building. These provide greater agility in fiber deployment and antenna siting process, which benefits not only current network expansion, but is also particularly important for upcoming 5G networks deployment. Other recent federal legislation has reduced taxation on Internet of Things devices and services, as well as machine-to-machine communications, benefiting the telecommunications services providers as well as end users. Furthermore, new legislation has been also approved to facilitate the allocation of the Universal Services Fund to using in broadband infrastructure projects, particularly in unserved rural and remote areas. Another important development came through the recently approved changes to the General Telecommunications Law. This includes procedures for telecom concession holders to migrate to a more flexible authorization regime. Additionally, there are provisions that will enable telecom operators to simplify renewals of spectrum authorizations as well as spectrum trading among the operators. The clear priority is to deploy broadband infrastructure to expand fixed and mobile high-quality broadband access to people, business, and government. Alongside the Ministry of Communications, the telecoms regulator Anatel, when I came from, plays a key role in implementing this robust regulatory framework. Finally, I would like to mention the two recent OECD peer reviews entitled Telecommunication and Broadcasting Review of Brazil 2020 and Going Digital in Brazil. We have highlighted that broadband network infrastructure is essential for us to implement our national digital transformation strategy. In conclusion, I wish to thank the OECD for this invitation and say that it is an honor to celebrate with you the launch of the new Council Recommendation on Broadband Connectivity, an instrument that provides excellent guidance and is the result of a great collaborative work at the Committee on Digital Economy Policy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And let me just extend my thanks to both Vice Minister Cho and Deputy Minister Menendez for your insights, and congratulations on the accomplishments both of you have made in your two countries. It's very impressive. I also want to thank you for sharing your country's experience in implementing the OECD broadband recommendation of the Council on broadband connectivity. Now, with that, I now hand over the floor to my colleague, Verena Weber, to kick off the panel discussion. And again, thank you very much for starting us off.
Thank you, Andy. And it is my honor and really my true pleasure to present our distinguished panelists today and moderate this panel on the importance of connectivity, during which we will discuss what policies and regulatory measures are effective towards our joint goal, which is ensuring connectivity for all, and which is the title of our high-level event. So we're joined today by very impressive female decision makers that are bringing different perspectives to this panel. And I'm inviting you all to turn on your cameras. So to lend a regulatory and competition policy perspective, we are joined by Mrs. Cani Fernandez, who is the president of the Spanish regulator, the CNMC. We also have the pleasure of welcoming Ms. Boutaina Germasi from the World Bank for an international development perspective. And we're having Ms. Monica Aspe, the CEO of AT&T Mexico, and whom many of you in the audience know has been the former Vice Minister of Communications in Mexico and also the former Mexican ambassador to the OECD. And she will provide us with both a policy and business perspective. So let me flag right from the start that at the end of the panel, we're having a question and answer section. So let me invite you all to ask your questions using the question and answer button that you have at the bottom of your screen at any time during the panel. And then we're taking a question and asking the panelists. Now with this, let me start the panel. And let me begin with asking a question to Mrs. Fernandez. So Ms. Fernandez, according to the latest EU data, Spain is the place to be, it seems, when it comes to high-speed connectivity. So your country has the highest number of households with fixed high-speed connections of over 100 megabits per second. So that means, which is really impressive, that roughly 2/3 of all Spanish households are connected at very high speeds. So could you share with us how you managed to obtain those impressive results and what tips you have from regulators around our virtual table today, seeking to boost the deployment of high capacity networks?
Well, thank you very much to the OECD. Thank you very much, Verena. You are right. The DESI 2020 report shows that Spain is the country in Europe with the highest uptake of ultra-fast, as you say, 100 megabits per second, broadband connections. Spain is at 65% versus the European Union average of 32.9%. Also, according to the 2020 DESI report, Spain is one of the European leaders in terms of coverage of fixed very high capacity networks, FTTH and DOCSIS 3.1, with a coverage close to 90%. Spain is number 4 in terms of percentage of national coverage, only behind Malta, Denmark and Luxembourg, all of them quite smaller countries than we are. And Spain is number 1 in terms of absolute number of building units, households, business units passed. Telefónica Spain has the largest FTTH network in Europe. FTTH network has been deployed by telecom operators, of course, but we think that Spain's fiber rollout has been fostered thanks to the CNMC, the authority that I chair, the Commission for Markets and Competition, thanks to our wholesale fixed broadband regulation, which promoted investment in new infrastructure while ensuring competition at the same time. The 2009 and 2016 regulatory frameworks that were following the liberalization process and the implementation of the different methodologies stated by the European directives have contributed to Spain's successful rollout of NGNs and to the development of a highly competitive retail market in our country. At present, we are working on the 2021 market review. Certainly, one of the most relevant aspects of this review is the update of the geographic segmentation. I can share afterwards if there are any questions which have been the measures that we have put in place during the first regulatory period, the first review in 2009, and then in 2016, which were the kind of measures that we took. But currently, our review is, perfectly aligned with the OECD recommendation on broadband connectivity, which recommends periodic reviews of the regulatory frameworks to ensure their continued adequacy and appropriateness, and to identify improvements when were necessary. In relation to the tips for regulators around our virtual table, I must say that in general, guaranteeing that regulation is stable and predictable should be a priority. If regulation is not predictable and it's not stable, investments won't come, and this is obviously the must in order to deploy this kind of broadband connections. However, at the same time, regulation should be capable of evolving alongside the competitive landscape. For example, in Spain, competitive conditions were not the same in 2009. There was an absence of investment in NGA, as in 2016, where there were very relevant FTTH deployments by several operators. And this led us to propose different measures for each period. In 2021, the situation is also different, which is why we are reviewing the market again. The measures adopted by NBAs depend on crucial factors that may differ between member states, so national regulatory authorities have to be taking into account those differences. For example, the state of competition and the number of operators that can realistically be expected to invest in each country. Where countries where physical infrastructure and in particular ducts are widely available, as was the case in Spain, measures to stimulate the sharing of this infrastructure have proven to be fundamental. In fact, this is not so different from what we have seen in the mobile sector, where operators increasingly share their sites. Integrating innovative elements, such as geographic segmentation, in order to encompass competition and gradually going into a level playing field in the different territories where the conditions of competition are not homogeneous, or flexibility in wholesale pricing into regulators' analysis may also be very helpful in this respect. Let me leave it here, and if there are questions later on, I will be very happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Fernandez. And the 90% coverage is truly impressive, because this means that you're covering a lot of rural and remote areas. Yeah. And with this, let me turn to Ms. Garmasi. So to basically go a bit deeper into rural and remote areas. So Ms. Garmasi, you're heading a global team, which is working on building digital economies in developing countries. You're advising policymakers and regulators, in particularly on how to improve broadband connectivity and close digital divides. And this is quite an important pillar of our OECD recommendation on broadband connectivity. In your experience, in the experience of the World Bank, what are the major hurdles you consider that countries face to bridge the connectivity divides? And how can the recommendation serve as a roadmap for emerging and developing countries?
Thank you so much, Verena. Thanks for the question, and thanks for the invitation today. First, I really would like to congratulate the OECD for the adoption of the recommendation on digital connectivity. This topic is of paramount importance for all countries, regardless of their level of development, a core foundation for digital economy, a core foundation for digital transformation, and of course, a topic that increased importance in the context of the COVID situation. The topic of connectivity divide is very important for the World Bank because it is very difficult to imagine the possibility to eradicate extreme poverty or reach shared prosperity, which are the twin goals of the bank, in a world divided in two groups, those with access to broadband connectivity and those lagging behind. So we look at the digital divide really through the gaps that can amplify existing inequalities, both between countries, but within countries, inequalities in terms of economic gains, economic financial inclusion, job opportunities, and all the life-enhancing opportunities that digital offer. We look at there are different barriers for inclusion, for digital inclusion, and three of them are very important, I think, and the recommendations spoke to all of them. The first one is the issue around financing, persisting financing gaps, especially in hard-to-reach areas. The second one is stubborn reforms and persisting regulatory gaps in many countries. And the third one is the lack of digital inclusion policies that tackle the demand gap. If we think about the financing issues, ITU has estimated that the global cost to connect the unconnected is around $428 billion US. Of course, this takes place in a context of limited fiscal space for governments. So there is a lot of expectations on the private sector, which in turn needs the right environment, the right playing field to make sure that there is more investment, both to reach the unreached areas, but also to increase the capacity of existing networks and to make sure that there is a good platform for the new technology that are here and are important for development. So here it's important to explore innovative financing approaches, innovative approaches to deal with the market gap. The second important gap is issues around regulation. And here the recommendation provides very good guidance on digital regulation and policies to enable investment, enable competition, and enable innovation. It is an area of top priority and possible intervention that were listed in the guidelines are very important, from simplified licensing to transparent and predictable spectrum management. And it was really nice to hear the experience from Brazil earlier, and the experience from Spain, and the experience from Korea. The issues around infrastructure sharing is very important. They are all part of the toolkit of regulatory reforms that we do include in our projects, in our policy matrices as we work on development lending. And this is also very much aligned with best practices at the country level, also best practices that are emerging through the work, for example, that we are doing with ITU on the Digital Regulatory Handbook. The other issue, which is, I think, a little bit more difficult to tackle, is the issue around the usage gap. While I think there is a lot of progress made in the access gap and still a lot of work that needs to happen, the issue of the usage gap is complicated. And according to the GSMA, the usage gap is now 6 times larger than the coverage gap. So if we just take the example of Africa, we know that 2/3 of the unconnected, they have coverage of 3G and 4G, but there is a gap on using the internet. And here, there are multiple reasons for that. Affordability is definitely a very important one. Affordability of data plans, affordability of handsets, but also the issues around relevant content, the issues around digital capabilities that are very important to tackle. In this regard, it's nice to read the OECD recommendation that clearly mention the importance of prioritizing support to adoption in low-income and non-adopting households, as well the rural and remote communities. Maybe my last point here is the importance of the ecosystem approach that was highlighted in the recommendation. It's important as we think about digital connectivity. We think about it in terms of sustainability as well. So very nice to see a dedicated pillar on mitigating the negative environmental impact of broadband networks. And it's clear that the digital agenda and the green agenda need to go hand in hand. I'll stop here. Happy to take more questions.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Germasi. Those are all very important points. We have been following Mexico for quite a while, looked at what is hindering lower income groups in terms of adoption, how this has to do with affordability. And you're also mentioning our first pillar of the OECD recommendation, which is all about the right policies to foster competition, investment, and innovation. So if we turn to Mexico, what we could see and what Audrey has mentioned before is that since the 2013 telecommunication reform, the country has added over 72 million additional mobile broadband subscribers. And what we could see is that the entry of AT&T definitely fostered competition and also brought prices down. So there we get to the affordability issue. And this way, actually, many people would connect for the first time because they didn't have the means to connect before, because the reform led to increased coverage, but also significant reduction in prices. Now, if I turn to Ms. Aspe, according to you, what were the most effective policy levers in Mexico to achieve those fantastic results, to connect that many additional people?
Thank you, Verena. We know that bridging the broadband connectivity or the infrastructure divide is required to bridge the digital divide. And this has to be a multi-stakeholder task. So I really celebrate this recommendation, both because of its content and because of the processes OECD follows to reach such recommendations. And thank you, of course, for this invitation as a representative of the private sector, also because of the very fond memories that OECD and its very talented secretariat always brings to me. And what a fantastic female panel, by the way. So as the recommendation states, good regulation promotes investment and innovation and really reduces in this way the digital divide. In the 2013 telecommunications reform in Mexico, as you know, it included several of the OECD recommendations to improve the conditions of economic competition in Mexico's telecom sector. And that included a new institutional framework, an independent autonomous, really an autonomous regulator with powers to apply asymmetric regulation to the incumbent. We call it a preponderant, but it's really an incumbent. And this was crucial for the entrance of new network operators into the market, notably AT&T, and also for the massive investment in infrastructure from already existing operators, both in mobile and in wireline or fixed services, as well as service innovation that followed. So the network quality and the offers for consumers have really been strengthened in the last years, as already highlighted by some of you. And however, the concentration in the market has not been reduced enough, particularly in mobile services, not as much as expected. The reform helped ultimately to create an environment that allowed for the prices mobile services to be reduced, both in nominal and in real terms. And affordability is a key driver of digital inclusion, right? So as Mrs. Germasi and others have pointed. So since the reform, the prices of mobile services have been reduced approximately 30% in nominal terms, 45% in terms. And importantly, reduced prices have enabled these telecom services to be more affordable to low-income segments of the population. So for example, in 2014, 30% the lowest decile families access to telecom services, 30%. 2 years later, it was 40% of the lowest of all decile sectors. So these have been really, economic competition can be social policy. So big strides made, but nevertheless, multi-stakeholder work must continue in order to improve competitive market conditions to really strengthen these asymmetric regulations in both fixed and mobile services. And of course, there are challenges, right? Improvements in the telecom sector have found opposition, which is fully understandable. And the regulator's autonomy and technical expertise have been challenged by some. It's particularly important to continue with the implementation of this regulation, like Spain has done in many ways, for example, talking about representations in today's event. So until we really achieve the effective competitive conditions we need in both fixed and mobile services. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Asve. And sorry, it's great to hear actually that economic competition can be a social policy. That's a very strong sentence. And let's stay a bit at the topic of competition, because what we've seen actually over and over is that competition is one of the strongest levers to extend connectivity and increase the quality of networks. So on this, my next question would go to Ms. Fernandez. From Spain points of view, and in particular from your perspective as the head of the regulator, what are some key policies and regulatory measures that effectively foster competition in communication markets?
Well, thank you very much. As you may know, but I would explain it in any case. Allow me to repeat maybe something that you already know. The CNMC, the Commission for Markets and Competition, is not only the telecoms regulator, but it is also the competition authority in Spain. We are an integrated authority. So when we are dealing with ex-ante regulation, as it is in the field of telecom, we are also including competition principles in absolutely everything we do. And it is also our role to exert some supervision on what is happening in the market, exposed, as we are, as I was saying as well, a competition agency, so an integrated authority. So regarding competition, I must underline that the impressive rollout of the NGNs in Spain has been driven by several operators. And it is maybe because we are keeping an eye on how the process of competition is in the market, that they are competing fiercely. The CNMC's report on the last quarter of 2020 shows that the first operator in the market has deployed or has passed 25.9 million of BUs, the second 15.3 million, the third 11.3 million, the fourth 9 million, and the last one 2.6 million. All these investments in NGA network have not come at the expense of retail competition. Because, for example, a new entrant in 2016 is now the fourth operator in the market. And he has been the clear winner of this period, going from 0 to 12% of market share in fixed broadband in only 4 years. So we've kept the muscle, the competition muscle at hand. And once you have created a framework in which operators can compete, it is just a question of monitoring the market so that they compete in loyal terms, that they compete in a level playing field, and that you have to remove all the barriers to access the networks or all the barriers to access the ducts. That's why the accessing obligations that I was referring before have played a very, very significant role. So the role of the National Regulatory Authority is to set the right regulatory framework to help maximize private investments in NGA. In Spain, although the role of state aid has been and will be very important, of course, the majority of fiber networks have been built with private investments. Around 5 million of the current 26 million building units with access to at least one FTTH network have been built in part with the state aid, but the other 21 million, many of them with access to several FTTH networks, have been built entirely with private investment. However, you were mentioning the 90% of coverage. Once you surpass this 90 coverage threshold, it is clear that the role of a state aid will be more and more relevant in order to achieve 100% NGA coverage. At that point, I think that not only FTTH, but also fixed wireless access, especially with 5G, will be a key technology to reach this 100% coverage goal. So let me leave it there, and we can discuss more aspects later on if you want. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fernandez. And yes, we see that actually here in some cities in Spain, you can choose between, I think, up to 4 fiber offers. Plus, you mentioned that you also have quite competitive cable offers. So this is impressive. You also mentioned the role of state aid and the role of governments. And this might get even more pronounced now as we are in the pandemic. So what we're seeing is, if we look a bit at the effects of the pandemic, we've seen that disadvantaged groups and low-income populations have particularly been impacted by COVID-19. And this is not only true for developed countries, but is actually an even more pronounced situation in developing countries. So if I'm turning to Mrs. Garumasi, based on your experience at the World Bank, and if you look back at the past year, if you look, now we're about a year into the pandemic. So what are some of the successful measures countries around the world have taken to close connectivity gaps in particular among disadvantaged groups and among low-income households?
Thanks, Verena. You know, when countries started to implement lockdown measures, we were concerned about the digital alternatives that disadvantaged groups could have in many of our countries. What we've seen is an incredible reaction and incredible collaboration between the public sector and the private sector. And we saw swift measures to allow voluntary infrastructure sharing, facilitating access to spectrum, providing more flexibility in licensing rules, and encouraging measures that helped lower the cost for the end users. So a number of measures happened across many countries that helped really households deal with the issue of the pandemic and use digital to cope. And there were very clear lessons from the crisis is about digital readiness, as we've seen countries with good regulatory framework, with good infrastructure, with good data protection, they were more able to cope than others. So looking at the specific examples, I'm happy to share from our portfolio a number of cases about how we are tackling connectivity gaps in projects and dealing with some specific circumstances. The first specific circumstance is small island countries, where the approach that the bank took is to support them think about digital connectivity in a regional approach. So in the Caribbean, we supported 3 small island states of Grenada, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and Grenadine, which were lagging behind in terms of broadband access. And the approach they took is joining forces to get a technological leapfrog through an undersea fiber optic cable connection, which helped connectivity to government, schools, and households. And the regional approach was very important for these small countries and small islands. And in the context of the COVID crisis, it was nice to see that during the peak of the crisis, the government network was quickly expanded, almost doubling in fiber capacity to accommodate the increased bandwidth needs for services. So that's one example on a small island. The other one, which you mentioned in the beginning, the rural connectivity solutions. And as we know, improving connectivity in rural areas can be challenging, and it does require a combination of market solutions and sometimes direct intervention and direct support from public resources. In Niger, for example, we're working with the government on the Smart Villages project. And the project supports policy regulatory reforms in the telecom sector to create enabling environments while financing also a reverse auction. So in this case, private sector service providers, tower companies bid for the minimum level of subsidy that is needed to make sure that there is access in rural communities. And we're targeting 2,000 rural communities here. The Niger example is also important because we're not only focusing on tackling the issues around the access, but also supporting on the demand side. So here we include activity to boost digital adoption, include the digital and financial literacy campaigns, modernizing farmers' cooperative payment devices to allow digital payment, and working a lot on the demand stimulation because tackling supply and demand issues is very important to improve connectivity in rural areas. And maybe another example that would be worth sharing is the possibility to think about innovative models and the possibility to think outside of the box. And on the connectivity, there is a space for that also. So a couple of years ago, we've partnered with the government of Peru and Airbus to experiment connected buses that could provide broadband connectivity to communities living in remote areas in the country. A similar approach was used by the city of Austin in the US that equipped its 110 school buses with Wi-Fi and positioned in locations where students could connect to the network. So here we're also trying to see where are the community places where we can work on community networks, which can provide also a node for the broader community to use reliable connectivity. So these are only few examples. Of course, we cannot replicate existing models, and each country will have its own context that would warrant the right choice. But in many cases, we found that there are some guiding principles that are very important, and they are very much, aligned with the recommendation of the guidelines. The first one is we need to improve regulatory environment and the level playing field. This is very important. Without this, we cannot mobilize private sector investment. The second guiding principle is adopting this ecosystem approach that tackles both demand and supply. It's very difficult to say, let's fix the supply issue and demand will come. I think it's important to think about it as a whole. They drive each other. The third one is the importance of technology neutrality to foster competition between technology choices. Mobile and fixed lines and satellites and TV white spaces, there is a competition among connectivity options that if we have good conditions of technology neutrality, they can boost the connectivity for remote and rural areas. And of course, the importance of targeted digital inclusion policies for disadvantaged groups and disadvantaged area. Thanks, Verena.
Thank you very much for this tour of the world with out-of-the-box examples, impressive examples, both for keeping or getting people connecting during the pandemic, but also having a bit of a longer-term perspective, looking at sound and robust regulatory frameworks. Now, looking at the pandemic, Ms. Aspe, you actually took over the CEO position of AT&T during the first month of the health emergency, and you have been hailed as someone who faced and addressed the company's challenges during these unprecedented times. So we would be quite curious to know how AT&T Mexico dealt with increased demands on communication networks due to the pandemic, and also what you've done to improve the resilience of networks, which is also a big pillar of our recommendation.
Thank you, Verena. So during the toughest months of lockdown, the economic, educational, social activities of people shifted traffic from business and school areas to homes, to residential areas. And this, as you know, happened everywhere from one day to the next day with no preparation for it. If we look at Google data on mobility, it dropped by 50% in the working areas, while in residential areas, it increased in Mexico's case almost 25%. So more than an absolute increase, what we saw was a shift from some areas into others, and the networks needed to adjust to that. So network consumption was redistributed. And as mentioned before, it increased in these areas, and that put a lot of pressure for the network. So this came also with an increase in certain kinds of applications, collaborative applications, entertainment, the use of apps, for example, to order food at home, all these things. And so what happened really is that networks responded. I'll talk about AT&T Mexico network, responded to these changes in traffic demand and patterns through very solid foundations. So both in terms of network resilience and in terms of team crisis management, because of course it takes both things for networks to work correctly. We acted on time, but to be fair, the whole industry did. And this says something about the industry beyond our individual work. So most importantly, I think that we had previously done the necessary investments before the crisis came. Resiliency is built before a crisis, not when a crisis arrives. And the quality of the telecommunications networks in Mexico predating the telecom reform, I am certain would have not been able to face such a crisis. So I actually think this goes to the broadband recommendation. Correct, the pertinent regulation drives investment, drives competition, that drives investment, and that really drives better networks and better companies that are able to be more resilient when a crisis arrives. So let me add that with these traffic shifts, also revenues for the mobile industry dropped. It was revenues for fixed companies that increased, but for mobile, they dropped. So it was also an economic challenge, a financial challenge for companies at the same time that we had the network and the technical challenge. So we're recovering now. But I would also add that part of the challenge was that during the pandemic, during the toughest months of lockdown, as traffic shifted and revenues dropped, we were taking on Telefónica's traffic onto our network, since we have a wholesale business and Telefónica is migrating all of their traffic onto our network nationwide. And this started precisely during the pandemic, and we managed. So that's a lot about, again, building the foundations in a timely way for when a crisis comes. So now we're focused on maintaining our historic levels of investment. We invest approximately 50%, half of the total mobile investments in the country. Focused on retail, innovative offers, highly personalized. That there's innovation to service level, not only on the infrastructure level. And also the wholesale business, which of course complements the retail business and creates more scale in order to compete with the incumbent player. And then the offer of value-added services. So DirecTV Go, soon HBO Max, etc., we have now become part of this very relevant ecosystem. So big challenge, a very clear example of why the correct regulation and having strong networks matters before a crisis and not when a crisis comes.
Thank you very much, Ms. Osprey, and I note how you really highlight the importance of regulation. And congratulations for not taking over only additional traffic during the pandemic, but also the traffic of another operator in the country. Very well done. So talking about strong regulation, or let's say also adaptive regulation. Ms. Fernandez, we're now opening the panel discussion to questions from the floor, and we got one for you in this respect. Our audience is asking, besides geographic segmentation, does Spain also include or plan to include age segmentation?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. When I refer to geographic segmentation, what I was in fact trying to tackle was the difference in competition conditions. So you may be facing a situation in which in a region, a particular region, or even in a town, the geographical level that you take, the deployment of networks is not the same. So there is a difference in conditions of competition, and you cannot try, or you cannot in fact include all the regions at the same level for the measures, the regulatory measures that you have to adopt. So in order for competition to be possible, you have to depart from the existing conditions of the market, and those vary from region to region. I'm not that sure that this is the case for age segmentation. I think age segmentation, for example, is very relevant when we deal with another role we have, audiovisual supervision. There you have to be very, very vigilant in age regarding content or regarding access to a specific content, for example. But regarding competition in networks, that you have to deploy, geographically speaking, there I think geography is an element that you have to take into account. I'm not sure that age is an element that you have to take into account.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Fernandez. And I'm taking another question from the floor, and this question comes from our chair of the OECD Working Party on Communications Infrastructure and Services Policy, Bengt Mudderud. So Bengt has a question to Ms. Girmassi. Is finance the largest challenge really to bridge the digital divide, or are there also other issues we should focus on?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of three issues. I think finances is an important one. And today in the context of the COVID situation, the fiscal space for more investment in the sector is becoming a little bit challenging. So in order to make sure that the private sector does more on this, we need to make sure that the right conditions exist. And all the discussion from the beginning today, was very clear that the importance of competition rules, the importance of fair rules of the game, the importance of licenses that are predictable, the issues around, supporting the private sector to push the envelope as much as possible will not happen without those fair rules of the game. So while financing is a big issue, I think a big part of it will happen with the right policy and the right regulatory environment that will need to happen across the value chain of the internet, from the first mile to the middle mile to the last mile to the last users in their homes.
Thank you very much. And we're having a question to Ms. Aspe from Mrs. Martinez, who is asking, what were the specific recommendations for the Mexican government to connect more people in Mexico at affordable prices and attract more investment in the short term?
So I guess the question goes to the 2013 telecommunication reform. I think it would apply in other countries as well, more notably in Mexico because of the very high market concentration. But really having a technical independent regulator with the necessary funding and capacities to establish regulation that is independent from both political context and from industry. And that's really independent. That I think was a huge change. And then we had and we still have as a country, of course, a framework of economic competition like the one that has been described here for other countries. but we added this figure of preponderance, having 50% or more of market share, as a second way of establishing asymmetric regulations without having the litigious long path to establish and really implement asymmetric regulation, which had been very hard to do in the country. So I would say those not enough if we look at existing levels of market concentration, especially in mobile, but definitely a big advancement when we think of driving investment, therefore driving affordability of prices for the population, and therefore really very impressive numbers in terms of digital inclusion in the last years. But more to come, right? And this is a target always, so the country needs to keep moving.
Thank you very much. And I would actually have another question for you, but I would also be interested in Mrs. Garmasi's answers to the same question, which is about the upcoming new mobile standard 5G. So do you foresee that the current spectrum policies across Latin America are a risk for 5G deployment and for maybe closing the digital divide?
I see a challenge in terms of spectrum. And I say this because, of course, we all understand that there are fiscal considerations and that spectrum is taxed. But at the time, it's important that countries take a pragmatic view of what a country wants to do in terms of direct taxing for this spectrum versus lower taxing, maybe higher coverage, and therefore increased taxation through this mechanism. America tends to have high spectrum prices. Definitely Mexico is above international standards in terms of the cost of spectrum, and that of course is not a good thing for the fast deployment of very expensive technologies in countries where revenues not always justify from a market perspective a fast deployment of this technology. So I think it's a needed conversation. It has to be done in the stakeholder and organization. So we do well, because it does matter for the future of the region.
Thank you very much. And Mrs. Garmasi, what is your view on that question?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to Monica. I mean, 5G, when we talk about it, it's important for development. It's a technology that will revolutionize the sector. It's driven by use cases. So a new generation of technology that will have a very deep impact on society, especially looking at the application side. So creating conditions for this technology to evolve is very important, and there is always a trade-off, an important one. Do we create conditions for a longer-term return to government and think about, more possibilities that will be linked with more adoption and, more taxes that will come because of all of this? Or do we get those returns upfront? It's a policy discussion at all countries. I think it is very important to think about it with a long-term perspective, see the gains for development that are foreseen, and allow the conditions for this to happen without major hurdles in the beginning.
Thank you very much. And I have, I think, 1 more minute or 2 more minutes for a last question that I will address to Ms. Fernandez to close the panel. And I'm sorry, it's a pretty tough one. So when we're talking about regulatory environments, the question is, what is the right regulatory environment? We see that a splintered world on this at this stage. So we have various regulatory frameworks all over the world. Do you have any sense that there might be some more global convergence on regulations?
Well, thank you very much. As a start, why don't we all follow the OECD recommendations? That would be my first. Then we could reach a global understanding of the problem and a more homogeneous answer altogether. But let me go into, well, the area I know better, the CNMC regulatory action. And even if it is one member state regulatory action, it cannot be fully understood outside the general context of the European Union legislative framework. And this will answer your question. If we understand that the fact that even if we have deployed our networks in a quicker way, in fact, we are answering to a common framework. And this common framework at the European Union level, I think it is a very good tool in order to understand problems more globally. To give you an example, the European Commission in the priorities of digital transformation has adopted a set of rules, or a set of tools, and among these new structural measures that they are adopting, the most recent one is the recommendation on a common union toolbox for reducing the cost of deploying very high capacity networks and ensuring timely and investment-friendly access to the 5G radio spectrum. So when we see that the problems are global, we are trying to give also global solutions. And that, I think, is good in terms of the right regulation of the right environmental framework. So the recommendation, for example, compels member states to work together to identify common best practices for rolling out very high capacity networks, including 5G, and working with the Commission. And this will happen by April 30th. So it's just around the corner. So we have to provide the European Commission our individual roadmaps to implement them at the national level. So we are trying to, in a way, come together in order to devise what would be the necessary regulation. So where to act and where to be having a common understanding of the problems in order to be even more cost efficient. So that, I think, is going to help us to have an efficient regulation that will only intervene whenever it is necessary. So that's an example of what we can do. But there are many other things. Of course, in these COVID times that we are living, it is also important to tackle the problems of the crisis. It's not only the regulation that we need to have in order to regulate the sector, but also good regulation here means that we have to add as well, in order to have an efficient regulation, new elements, like, for example, the recovery funds that were have been discussed at the European level, and that fortunately we can now start to deploy, because the German Constitutional Court has rejected, as you may know, the appeal against those funds. In April 13, the Spanish government published the plan for the management and development of the European Recovery Fund, and digital connectivity, cybersecurity, and the deployment of 5G is there. We are doing that again in a framework that is more global. So maybe the answer to your question is we probably will need to go global in order to have a better regulation in this, in order to be more efficient, in order to adopt the efficient element in the deployment of investments, because that will also help us to have a better and faster deployment of what we need. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Fernandez. And I'll borrow one sentence from you for the closing remark of the panel. Let's all implement the OECD recommendation on broadband connectivity. So let's give our panel really a big round of virtual applause. You've been fantastic. Thank you very much for this very strong female panel, for your expertise, for taking the time to share your experiences. And with this, I would like to hand over to Audrey Blanc for our closing remarks.
Thanks, Verena, and thanks to the panelists. It's unfortunately time to close our event, but on behalf of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, I want to thank you for this discussion today and reiterate it's very rare that we get to have a female panel like this on this topic. So thank you so much. I want to specifically thank Vice Minister Cho, Deputy Minister Menendez, Ms. Fernandez-Vician, Ms. Aspe Bernal, and Ms. Gomez for your valuable participation, as well as for all the audience who took time today to be with us on this webinar and for engaging so actively. I thought the questions were fantastic. So thank you to all, as well as the team. I want to just really pause and thank Verena Weber and her team. Some of them are here today. I think all of them are here today. Alexia, Max, Fred, Lauren, Nikki. Please put on your camera and wave and get the recognition you all deserve for all the work you do behind the scenes to make this happen. Without it, we would not have this recommendation. And so thank you so much to the team, as well as I just want to thank the staff behind these events that really make it possible, specifically Marianne Barberis, who's here today, but also the interpreters, as well as our conference center staff. So with that, I want to thank you all again, Deputy Secretary General Knudsen, as well as Director Wyckoff for your participation, and challenge you all to go implement the recommendation.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.